The dog hit the floor the second she walked in. Not lay down, not settle. Hit the floor, dropped his massive head between his paws like a soldier at parade rest, eyes locked on Petra Vance like she was the only thing in the room worth watching. And she hadn't even looked at him yet. She was still at the intake desk, signing her name on a clipboard, asking the receptionist whether the X-ray machine in exam room 2 had been recalibrated after last week's malfunction. She had her back to the waiting area. She didn't know the dog existed. Staff Sergeant Colton Briggs knew. Colton always knew what his dog was doing. It was practically a biological reflex after 4 years in the same unit. He felt the shift in Apollo's body before he saw it, the way the shepherd's 110 pounds of muscle went from coiled tension to something he'd never seen before in all their time together. Something that looked uncomfortably like relief. He tugged the leash. Apollo. Sit! Apollo didn't sit. Apollo didn't move his eyes off the woman at the desk. Colton looked around at the other people in the waiting room. A teenage girl holding a tabby cat in a carrier, an older man with a beagle on his lap, 2 vet techs frozen in the doorway with folders pressed to their chests, all of them watching him and his dog with a particular kind of stillness. The kind people use when they're not sure whether to run. He couldn't blame them. Apollo had that effect. He's fine, Colton said, mostly to the vet techs, whose eyes kept dropping to the patch on his vest. Working dog. Do not touch. He's not going to do anything. He looked at Apollo, who had not moved, whose amber eyes had not shifted a single degree. He's just being weird. One of the vet techs, a young man with a name tag that said Brendan, cleared his throat. Is he the shepherd? The one Dr. Vance is expecting? Depends on who Dr. Vance is. She's our trauma specialist. She handles working dogs, service animals, military cases. Brendan gestured toward the desk. That's her. Colton turned. The woman was still writing. She had dark hair pulled back in a low knot, scrubs the color of sage, a pen she was clicking absently between signatures. She looked maybe 30. She moved through the intake paperwork with the particular efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times and still did it carefully anyway. He'd been told she was the best in the county at handling difficult animals. He'd been told she was calm under pressure. He'd been told a lot of things about her credentials, and he hadn't cared about any of them, because his experience with veterinarians and Apollo had been, up to this point, a disaster. Look, he said to Brendan, lower now. I need to be up front before she comes over here. He doesn't do well with new people. He's been evaluated 4 times in the last 8 months, and it's ended badly every time. I'm not saying he'll attack. He paused, because that was exactly what he was saying, but the last vet needed stitches. So I need whoever comes near him to be warned. Brendan went slightly pale. I'll let her know, he said, and immediately turned and walked to the desk with the posture of a man delivering news he didn't enjoy. Colton watched him lean close to the woman and speak quietly. He watched her stop writing. He watched her look up, not at Brendan, not at the form, but directly across the waiting room, straight at him. He didn't look away. He was a staff sergeant with 2 combat deployments and a chest full of commendations. He didn't look away from things. She looked at Apollo for a long moment. Then she went back to her clipboard. Colton frowned. She didn't come over right away. She finished the paperwork, capped her pen, said something to the receptionist that made the woman laugh, and then picked up a manila folder and walked toward them at a pace that suggested no particular urgency. He'd expected wariness. He'd expected the careful approach people used when they thought they might get hurt. He'd expected gloves, maybe, or a muzzle request. Staff Sergeant Briggs, she said, stopping about 6 feet away. Yeah, I'm Petra Vance. I'll be working with Apollo today. She didn't hold out her hand to him. She didn't look at the dog. She looked only at Colton. Your tech mentioned he's had some difficult experiences with exams. That's one way to put it. Can you walk me through what's happened? The previous attempts. He did. It took about 4 minutes. He described the muzzle that Apollo had broken through in 40 seconds, the table that had been overturned, the vet in Richmond who had called Apollo unexaminable and referred them out. He said it in a flat, factual tone because he'd learned there was no other way to say it. Anything softer, and people looked at him with pity. Anything harder, and they looked at Apollo like a liability. Petra listened without interrupting. She had a way of going still when she listened, not the frozen stillness of fear, but the settled stillness of attention. When he finished, she nodded once. What did they use for approach? She asked. What do you mean? When they approached him, did they come from the front, from the side? Did they crouch, stand? Did they make eye contact first or avoid it? Colton opened his mouth and then closed it. In all the debriefs and intake forms and apologetic phone calls, no one had ever asked him that. Front, he said after a moment. Always from the front. Direct. Eye contact. Petra wrote something in the folder. And how does he do with you? She asked. On the street, in the field. What's his tell when he trusts someone? Colton looked at Apollo, who was still on the floor, still watching Petra, still doing the thing that had no name. He goes loose, Colton said, which was the only word he had for it. In the shoulders, he kind of settles. Petra followed his gaze down to Apollo. For the first time since she'd walked over, she looked at the dog. Apollo's tail moved. Once. Barely. Like a flag in a still wind. Petra looked back at Colton. Give us about 10 minutes. I'm not letting you. In the room, she said. You'll be there. I just need you to hold the leash loose and not intervene unless I ask you to. Can you do that? The way she said it wasn't a challenge. It wasn't dismissive. It was just a clear request from someone who knew what she needed and was asking plainly. He'd had commanding officers who couldn't manage that. Yeah, he said, I can do that. Exam room 3 was smaller than Colton expected. There was no table, or rather the table was pushed against the wall, clearly not the intended workspace. Instead, there was a low mat in the center of the floor, the kind used in physical therapy, and a portable light set up at an angle that kept it out of Apollo's likely eyeline. On a low cart to one side, instruments arranged and covered with a cloth. Colton noticed that the instruments were covered. He noticed this because in every other exam room he'd been in with Apollo, the instruments had been laid out in plain sight and Apollo had fixated on them. He didn't say anything. He stood near the door, holding the leash loosely as instructed, and watched. Petra sat on the floor, not in a chair, not on a stool. On the mat, cross-legged, a foot or so away from where Apollo had positioned himself, her folder open in her lap. She wasn't looking at the dog. She was reviewing the folder, his medical history, his deployment record, the injury that had brought them here, a shrapnel wound to the left haunch that had healed wrong and been bothering him for 3 weeks. She turned pages. She made a small sound, not words, just a low ambient sound like humming without a tune. She'd been doing it since they walked in. It wasn't directed at Apollo. It was just there, background noise. Apollo's ears were rotating like satellites, tracking her. She turned another page. Apollo took one step toward her. Colton tightened his grip on the leash instinctively, and Petra said without looking up, loose. Thank you, he loosened. He hated loosening. Every trained instinct, he had said, control the situation, and he was standing in a small room watching his 90-pound combat dog inch toward a woman on the floor, and he had no idea what she was doing or why it was working. Because it was working. He could feel it from where he stood. Apollo wasn't moving like he moved toward a threat. He was moving like he moved toward food, or no, not food, something else. Something Colton hadn't seen in a long time. Apollo moved like he was remembering something, another step. He was close to her now, close enough that Colton's jaw was tight, and he was running scenarios automatically the way he always did. How fast could he pull? Which direction? What if? And then Apollo stopped. He put his nose on Petra's knee, not his teeth, not his paw, his nose. He pressed the cool, dry tip of it against her knee and held it there, and she turned a page, and the humming continued, and she still didn't look at him. 20 seconds, Colton counted. At 20 seconds, Petra set the folder aside. Her movements were unhurried, fully in her peripheral awareness. She knew exactly where Apollo was. That was obvious. She was tracking him the same way he tracked everything. But nothing about her posture indicated that she cared. She simply set the folder aside and rested her hands loosely in her lap. Apollo lifted his head. He looked at her face. She was looking at her own hands. Then, with the slow deliberateness of an animal that had made a decision, Apollo shifted his weight, stepped over her knee, and lay down across her legs. All 110 pounds of him. Colton stopped breathing. Petra let out a short breath. Not surprise exactly. Something more like the sound you make when you're moved by something, but you're not going to show it fully. Her hand came down slowly and rested on Apollo's back. Just rested. No petting, no pressure. Just contact. She looked up at Colton. Her eyes were very calm. He's been in pain for longer than 3 weeks, she said. My guess is closer to 6. You said he's been harder to settle at night? Colton nodded, not trusting his voice. And he's been more reactive on the left side, protective of it. Yeah, we thought it was behavior. It's pain. He's been guarding it. She glanced down at Apollo, who had not moved, who was breathing slowly and evenly across her legs, like she was the most natural resting surface in the world. He's been guarding it for a long time, and nobody's been able to get close enough to look at it, so he's been carrying it alone. She said it simply, clinically, but something in the phrasing, carrying it alone, landed somewhere in Colton's chest that he hadn't planned for. He turned toward the wall for a second, cleared his throat. Right, he said. So how do we fix it? It took 40 minutes. Petra examined the haunch with Apollo still partially draped across her, repositioning only as much as necessary, narrating quietly what she was doing and why. Not to Apollo. He wasn't a patient who could consent verbally. Not quite to Colton either. More like narrating for herself, keeping a running account of what she found, which Colton understood later was a clinical habit she probably wasn't aware of anymore. The shrapnel wound had healed but left scar tissue that was compressing a small bundle of nerves. He'd need a minor procedure, 12 days recovery, low activity. Colton stared at her when she said it. He's never been on low activity. There's a first time for everything. He doesn't do well with stillness. Neither do a lot of the dogs I see, she said. She was washing her hands at the small sink in the corner, and she spoke to him through the mirror. Neither do a lot of the handlers. She met his eyes in the mirror. When's the last time you were on leave? He didn't answer right away. Staff Sergeant Briggs, I heard you. I'm not your doctor, she said. I'm not asking because it's my job. I'm asking because your dog is a stress mirror. Whatever you're carrying, and I'm not saying I know what it is, he's been carrying it with you. Dogs do that, especially these dogs. She turned off the water and reached for paper towels. The wound didn't help, but the wound isn't why he's reactive. He's reactive because he's been watching you be reactive for however long it's been, and he's trying to protect you from something he can't identify, so everything becomes a threat. The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere, a phone rang twice and stopped. Colton looked at Apollo, who was still on the mat, watching him now with those amber eyes. The dog didn't look any different than he ever did. He looked exactly like Apollo. And somehow that was the thing that broke through, because Apollo had been with him through 2 deployments, through the thing in Kandahar he didn't talk about, through the 3 months stateside after where everything felt wrong and off-register, and he couldn't explain to anyone. He hadn't talked to anyone. He wasn't good at that. And all that time, Apollo had been there, running point on point, watching everything, flagging everything, going home with him at night, and lying across the foot of the bed, and it had never once occurred to Colton that the dog might be tired. He sat down on the mat. He wasn't sure when he'd decided to do it. His knees just kind of folded. Apollo immediately turned and put his head in Colton's lap, and Colton put his hand on the back of the dog's neck, and they stayed like that for a while. Petra didn't say anything. She stood near the sink and wrote notes and let them have the silence. He'd expected to schedule the procedure and leave. That's all he'd come for. A diagnosis and a plan, something actionable, something he could put in a report. He did not expect to sit in the small room off the lobby and drink bad coffee with Petra Vance for the better part of an hour. She wasn't pushing anything on him. That was the thing. She didn't pitch rehabilitation programs or ask him to fill out a mental health screen or tell him about resources with the practiced cadence of someone required to mention them. She just talked to him the way people talk to each other, asked him where he'd been stationed, told him she'd done a year of volunteer work at a base in North Carolina, asked whether he'd always worked with shepherds or whether Apollo was his first. He told her about Apollo. He hadn't told anyone the full version before, not his sister, not the guys in his unit, not the counselor he'd seen twice after Kandahar before deciding he was fine. But he told Petra, in pieces, over bad coffee, about finding Apollo in the kennel the week of his second deployment, about the training month in Texas in 105-degree heat, about the night on the outskirts of Helmand when Apollo had stopped dead in front of him for no visible reason, and he'd trusted it, and that trust had saved both their lives. About coming home. About how coming home had been harder, somehow, than the leaving. She listened the same way she'd listened in the waiting room. Like she had time, like there was no other appointment after this, no next patient, no clock to watch. He knew, logically, that she probably had a full schedule. He knew she was a professional, and this was a professional interaction. He told himself that twice in the middle of saying something about the first winter back, and the strange way sleep had stopped working right, and both times he kept talking anyway. At some point she said, "There's a group that meets on Thursdays." She made a small gesture that seemed to acknowledge every bad association the word group carried. Not what you're imagining, it's mostly handlers. Some active, some retired. They just talk about the dogs, mostly. The transition. I don't need a group. No, she said. Maybe not. She wrapped her hands around her paper cup. Apollo might, though. He'd be good with socialization, especially once he's post-recovery and the pain's gone. The reactivity is going to be easier to manage if he has positive exposures. He looked at her. She looked back, and the corner of her mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the acknowledgement that she'd just used his dog to make a point she could just as easily have made about him, and she knew he knew it, and she wasn't apologizing for it. He looked at the cup in his hands. "What day did you say?" "Thursday, 7 p.m. The address is on the clinic's website." He nodded. He didn't commit to anything. He wasn't ready to commit to anything, but he nodded. He brought Apollo in for the procedure on a Tuesday. He'd told himself he wouldn't ask about it when he dropped Apollo off. He'd say goodbye. He'd go sit somewhere for 3 hours. He'd come back. Standard. Apollo had been through procedures before. He was a military dog, not a puppy. Apollo, for his part, walked into the clinic with his tail up and his gait loose and immediately started looking around for Petra. He found her at the desk. His tail went faster. She came around the desk and crouched down without making a big production of it, and Apollo put both his front paws on her thighs and pressed his forehead against her collarbone, and she held the back of his head and said, "Good boy, I've got you." Colton stood at the door and watched the dog he had not, in 4 years, seen go to a stranger like that. Not once, not ever. The receptionist beside him, a woman named Ruth, who had the energy of someone's favorite grandmother, patted his arm. "He'll be just fine, honey," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I know." He drove to a coffee shop 2 blocks away and sat there for 3.5 hours. He ordered coffee and a sandwich he didn't eat, and he stared at his phone for a while, and then he put it down and tried to figure out what it felt like to not be in charge of anything for an afternoon. It felt bad, and then better, and then strange. He thought about Thursday. Apollo came out of the procedure fine. The scar tissue was cleaned up, and the nerve compression resolved. Petra came to the pickup herself to explain the recovery care, and she handed him a printed sheet of instructions and a small bag of medication, and then said, "He did great. He was a different dog in there, because the pain's gone, because he wasn't scared." She looked at Colton directly, the way she had from the start, not aggressively but clearly, with nothing held back. He wasn't scared because he trusted us. And he trusted us because he's seen that it's possible to be in a strange place with strange people and still be okay. Colton looked at Apollo, who was wearing a soft cone with the dignity of a dog who knew he was absurd and had decided to own it anyway. "He looks ridiculous," Colton said. "He's rocking it," Petra said. It was the first thing that had made Colton smile in he didn't know how long. It happened before he could stop it, and it was wide enough that she saw it, and she smiled back, and it was the particular smile of 2 people who have had a real conversation and are acknowledging it without making it strange. "Thursday," he said. 7 o'clock. He nodded and picked up at the bag and clipped Apollo's leash and walked toward the door, and Apollo walked beside him with the cone bobbing and his tail up and the looseness in his shoulders that meant he was all right, and Colton's own shoulders, somewhere around the door, went the same way. He didn't fully notice it, but it happened. He went on Thursday. He didn't tell himself he was going. He just was ready at 6:45, had the address pulled up, had Apollo's vest on, though it probably wasn't necessary. He sat in the truck outside the address for 6 minutes, which was longer than he would have admitted to anyone. Then he got out. There were 8 people inside, mostly men, 1 woman who had a Belgian Malinois at her feet. 3 dogs between them, 2 in working vests, 1 in retirement mode, stretched across 2 chairs with his back legs dangling off. The room smelled like coffee and dog, and the particular combination of people who weren't pretending with each other. Nobody made a big deal of him arriving. Somebody poured him coffee. He sat down. Apollo went directly to the Belgian Malinois, and they went through the ritual, nose to nose, sidestep, sniff, circling, and then both dogs settled, and it was fine. Colton watched his dog settle next to a stranger's dog, calm and quiet, and something in him that had been coiled for years began slowly to do the same. He didn't say much that night. He listened mostly. He heard things he recognized and things he had never heard anyone say out loud before, and both kinds hit him somewhere he hadn't expected. He went back the next Thursday, and the one after that. 6 weeks later, he was in the lobby of the clinic for Apollo's follow-up when Petra came out of the back and stopped when she saw them and said, "Look at you two," with a tone that wasn't sentimental but was warm in a way that didn't require sentiment. Apollo's tail was going. He was watching her with those amber eyes, completely steady, completely loose-shouldered, a dog that had stopped watching the world like a threat. "He's doing well?" she asked. "He's doing well," Colton said, and then, because he was better at this than he'd been 6 weeks ago, "I'm doing better." She nodded. She wrote something in the folder. She didn't make a thing of it, and that was exactly right, because making a thing of it would have ruined it. She just received it and moved on, and he thought, not for the first time, that she understood more about what people needed than most people did. "His weight is good, mobility looks restored," she said. "I'd clear him for full duty in about 2 more weeks. We've got time," Colton said. "There's no rush." She looked up from the folder briefly. "No," she said. "There isn't." He'd never said that before in his life. He could count on one hand the number of times in 4 years he'd chosen to go slower rather than faster, to wait rather than push, to let something take the time it needed. He wasn't sure when that had changed. Maybe it was Tuesday mornings with bad coffee. Maybe it was Thursday nights in a room that smelled like dogs and honesty. Maybe it was the particular way that Apollo had walked toward a woman on a mat 6 weeks ago and made a decision that turned out to be smarter than anything Colton had arranged. He looked at his dog, who was looking at Petra, tail still going. Good call, he thought. He meant it for Apollo. Somewhere, though, he also meant it for himself, the version of himself that had walked through that door with a dog he couldn't control and a chest full of things he hadn't said and had been, without knowing it, looking for exactly this. Not a fix, not a procedure, just someone who knew how to stay still long enough to make it safe to come close. Apollo had known it in about 30 seconds. Colton had taken a little longer, but he'd gotten there.